You're watching the Everything Network. Capone was born in New York City in 1899 to Italian immigrants. He joined the Five Points Gang as a teenager and became a bouncer in organized crime premises such as brothels. In his early 20s, Capone moved to Chicago and became a bodyguard and trusted factotum for Johnny Torrio, head of a criminal syndicate that illegally supplied alcohol, the forerunner of the outfit, and was politically protected through the Unione Siciliana. A conflict with the North Side Gang was instrumental in Capone's rise and fall. Torrio went into retirement after North Side gunmen almost killed him, handing control to Capone. He expanded the bootlegging business through increasingly violent means. But his mutually profitable relationships with Mayor William Hale Thompson and the Chicago Police Department meant he seemed safe from law enforcement. Capone apparently reveled in attention, such as the cheers from spectators when he appeared at baseball games. He made donations to various charities and was viewed by many as a modern-day Robin Hood. However, the St. Valentine's Day massacre, in which 7 gang rivals were murdered in broad daylight, damaged the public image of Chicago and Capone, leading influential citizens to demand government action and newspapers to dub Capone public enemy number 1. Federal authorities became intent on jailing Capone and charged him with 22 counts of tax evasion. He was convicted of 5 counts in 1931. During a highly publicized case, the judge admitted as evidence Capone's admissions of his income and unpaid taxes, made during prior and ultimately abortive negotiations to pay the government taxes he owed. He was convicted and sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. After conviction, he replaced his defense team with experts in tax law, and his grounds for appeal were strengthened by a Supreme Court ruling. But his appeal ultimately failed. He showed signs of neurosyphilis early in his sentence and became increasingly debilitated before being released after almost 8 years of incarceration. In 1947, he died of cardiac arrest after a stroke. Alphonse Gabriel Capone was born in Brooklyn, a borough of New York City, on January 17, 1899. His parents were Italian immigrants Gabriella Capone and Teresa Capone. His father was a barber and his mother was a seamstress, both born in Angri, a small commune outside of Naples in the province of Salerno. Capone's family had immigrated to the United States in 1893 by ship, first going through Fiume, modern-day Rijeka, Croatia, a port city in what was then Austria-Hungary. The family settled at 95 Navy Street, in the Navy Yard section of Brooklyn. When Al was aged 11, he and his family moved to 38 Garfield Place in Park Slope, Brooklyn. Capone's parents had 8 other children: James Vincenzo Capone, who later changed his name to Richard Hart and became a prohibition agent in Homer, Nebraska; Raffaele James Capone, also known as Ralph Capone or Bottles, who took charge of his brother's beverage industry; Salvatore Frank Capone; Ermina Capone, who died at the age of 1; Ermino John Capone; Albert Capone; Matthew Capone, and Mafalda Capone. Ralph and Frank worked with Al in his criminal empire. Frank did so until his death on April 1, 1924. Ralph ran Capone's bottling companies, both legal and illegal, early on, and was also the front man for the Chicago outfit until he was imprisoned for tax evasion in 1932. Al Capone showed promise as a student, but had trouble with the rules at his strict parochial Catholic school. His schooling ended at the age of 14, after he was expelled for hitting a female teacher in the face. He worked at odd jobs around Brooklyn, including a candy store and a bowling alley. From 1916 to 1918, he played semi-professional baseball. Following this, Capone was influenced by gangster Johnny Torrio, whom he came to regard as a mentor. Capone married May Josephine Coughlin at age 19 on December 30th, 1918. She was Irish Catholic and earlier that month had given birth to their son, Albert Francis Sonny Capone. Albert lost most of his hearing in his left ear as a child. Capone was under the age of 21, and his parents had to consent in writing to the marriage. By all accounts, the two had a happy marriage. In 1919, Capone left New York City for Chicago at the invitation of Torrio, who was imported by crime boss James Big Jim Colosimo as an enforcer. Capone began in Chicago as a bouncer in a brothel, where it is thought the most likely way for him to have contracted syphilis. Al was aware of being infected at an early stage, and timely use of Salvarsan probably could have cured the infection, but he apparently never sought treatment. In 1923, Capone purchased a small house at 7244 South Prairie Avenue in the Park Manor neighborhood in Chicago's South Side for a little over $5,000. According to the Chicago Daily Tribune, hijacker Joe Howard was killed on May 7, 1923, after he tried to interfere with the Capone-Torrio bootlegging business. In the early years of the decade, Capone's name began appearing in newspaper sports pages where he was described as a boxing promoter. Torrio took over Colosimo's criminal empire after the latter's murder on May 11, 1920, in which Capone was suspected of being involved. Torrio headed an essentially Italian organized crime group that was the biggest in Chicago, with Capone as his right-hand man. Torrio was wary of being drawn into gang wars and tried to negotiate agreements over territory between rival crime groups. The smaller North Side gang, led by Dean O'Banion, came under pressure from the Jenner brothers, who were allied with Torrio. O'Banion found that Torrio was unhelpful with the Jenners' encroachment, despite his pretensions to be a settler of disputes. In a fateful step, Torrio arranged the murder of O'Banion at his flower shop on November 10, 1924. This placed Jaime Weiss at the head of the gang, backed by Vincent Drucci and Bugs Moran. Weiss had been a close friend of O'Banion, and the North Siders made it a priority to get revenge on his killers. During Prohibition, Capone was involved with Canadian bootleggers who helped him smuggle liquor into the US. When Capone was asked if he knew Rocco Perry, billed as Canada's King of the Bootleggers, he replied, "Why, I don't even know which street Canada is on." Other sources, however, claim that Capone had certainly visited Canada, where he maintained some hideaways, but the Royal Canadian Mounted Police states that there is no evidence that he ever set foot on Canadian soil. An ambush in January 1925 left Capone shaken but unhurt. 12 days later, Torrio was returning from a shopping trip when he was shot several times. After recovering, he effectively resigned and handed control to Capone, aged 26, who became the new boss of an organization that took in illegal breweries and a transportation network that reached to Canada with political and law enforcement protection. In turn, he was able to use more violence to increase revenue. Any establishment that refused to purchase liquor from Capone often got blown up, and as many as 100 people were killed in such bombings during the 1920s. Rivals saw Capone as responsible for the proliferation of brothels in the city. Capone often enlisted the help of local members of the black community into his operations. Jazz musicians Milt Hinton and Lionel Hampton had uncles who worked for Capone on Chicago's South Side. Capone also sent 2 bodyguards to accompany jazz pianist Earl Hines on a road trip. Capone indulged in custom suits, cigars, gourmet food and drink, and female companionship. He was particularly known for his flamboyant and costly jewelry. His favorite responses to questions about his activities were, "I am just a businessman, giving the people what they want, and all I do is satisfy a public demand." Capone had become a national celebrity and talking point. The new Chicago boss based himself in Cicero, Illinois, after using bribery and widespread intimidation to take over town council elections, making it difficult for the Northsiders to target him. Al's driver was found tortured and murdered, and there was an attempt on Weiss's life in the Chicago Loop. On September 20th, 1926, the Northsiders used a ploy outside Capone's headquarters at the Hawthorne Inn, aimed at drawing him to the windows. Gunmen in several cars then opened fire with Thompson submachine guns and shotguns at the windows of the first-floor restaurant. Capone was unhurt and called for a truce, but the negotiations fell through. 3 weeks later, on October 11th, Weiss was killed outside the Northsiders' headquarters at O'Banian's former flower shop. The owner of Hawthorne's restaurant was a friend of Al's, and he was kidnapped and killed by Moran and Drucci in January 1927. He became increasingly security-minded and desirous of getting away from Chicago. As a precaution, he and his entourage would often show up suddenly at one of Chicago's train depots and buy up an entire Pullman sleeper car on a night train to Cleveland, Omaha, Kansas City, Little Rock, or Hot Springs, Arkansas, where they would spend a week in luxury hotel suites under assumed names. In 1928, Capone paid $40,000 to Clarence Butch of the Anheuser-Busch brewing family for a 10,000-square-foot home at 93 Palm Avenue on Palm Island, Florida, between Miami and Miami Beach. In November 1925, Capone's consigliere, Antonio Lombardo, was named head of the Unione Siciliana, a Sicilian-American benevolent society that had been corrupted by gangsters. An infuriated Joe Aiello, who had wanted the position himself, believed Capone was responsible for Lombardo's ascension and resented the non-Sicilians' attempts to manipulate affairs within the Unione. Aiello severed all personal and business ties with Lombardo and entered into a feud with Capone. Aiello allied himself with several other Capone enemies, including Jack Zutter, who ran vice and gambling houses together. Aiello plotted to eliminate both Lombardo and Capone, and starting in the spring of 1927 made several attempts to assassinate Capone. On one occasion, Aiello offered money to the chef of Joseph Diamond Joe Esposito's Bellinapoli Cafe, Capone's favorite restaurant, to put prussic acid in Capone's and Lombardo's soup. Reports indicated he offered between $10,000 and $35,000. Instead, the chef exposed the plot to Capone, who responded by dispatching men to destroy Aiello's bakery on West Division Street with machine gun fire. More than 200 bullets were fired into the bakery on May 28, 1927, hitting Joe's brother Antonio. During the summer and autumn of 1927, a number of hitmen Aiello hired to kill Capone were themselves slain. Among them were Anthony Russo and Vincent Spicuzza, each of whom had been offered $25,000 by Aiello to kill Capone and Lombardo. Aiello eventually offered a $50,000 bounty to anyone who eliminated Capone. At least 10 gunmen tried to collect on the bounty, but ended up dead. Capone's ally Ralph Sheldon attempted to kill both Capone and Lombardo for Aiello's reward, but Capone henchman Frank Nitti's intelligence network learned of the transaction and had Sheldon shot in front of a West Side hotel, although he survived the incident. In November 1927, Aiello organized machine gun ambushes across from Lombardo's home and a cigar store frequented by Capone, but those plans were foiled after an anonymous tip led police to raid several addresses and arrest Milwaukee gunman Angelo Lamantio and 4 other Aiello gunmen. After the police discovered receipts for the apartments in Lamantio's pockets, he confessed that Aiello had hired him to kill Capone and Lombardo, leading the police to arrest Aiello himself and bring him to the South Clark Street police station. Upon learning of the arrest, Capone dispatched nearly 24 gunmen to stand guard outside the station and await Aiello's release. The men made no attempt to conceal their purpose there, and reporters and photographers rushed to the scene to observe Aiello's expected murder. When released, Aiello was given a police escort out of the station to safety. He later failed to make a court appearance after his attorney claimed he suffered a nervous breakdown. Aiello disappeared with some family members to Trenton, NJ, from whence he continued his campaign against Capone and Lombardo. Chicago politicians had long been associated with questionable methods and even newspaper circulation wars, but the need for bootleggers to have protection in City Hall introduced a far more serious level of violence and graft. Capone is generally seen as having an appreciable effect in bringing about the victory of Republican mayoral candidate William Hale Thompson, who had campaigned on a platform of not enforcing prohibition, and at one time hinted that he'd reopen illegal saloons. Thompson allegedly accepted a contribution of $250,000 from Capone. Thompson beat Democratic candidate William Emmett Dever in the 1927 mayoral race by a relatively slim margin. On the day of the so-called Pineapple Primary on April 10, 1928, voting booths were targeted by Capone's bomber, James Belcastro, in wards where Thompson's opponents were thought to have support, causing the deaths of at least 15 people. Belcastro was accused of the murder of lawyer Octavius Granady, an African-American who challenged Thompson's candidate for the black vote, and was chased through the streets on polling day by cars of gunmen before being shot dead. 4 policemen were among those charged along with Belcastro, but all charges were dropped after key witnesses recanted their statements. An indication of the attitude of local law enforcement toward Capone's organization came in 1931 when Belcastro was wounded in a shooting. Police suggested to skeptical journalists that Belcastro was an independent operator. A 1929 report by the New York Times connected Capone to the 1926 murder of Assistant State Attorney William H. McSwiggan, the 1928 murders of Chief Investigator Ben Newmark, and former mentor Frankie Yale. Capone was widely assumed to have been responsible for ordering the 1929 St. Valentine's Day massacre, despite being at his Florida home at the time of the massacre. The massacre was an attempt to eliminate Bugs Moran, head of the North Side Gang, and the motivation for the plan may have been the fact that some expensive whiskey illegally imported from Canada via the Detroit River had been hijacked while it was being transported to Cook County, Illinois. Moran was the last survivor of the North Side gunmen. His succession had come about because his similarly aggressive predecessors had been killed in the violence that followed the murder of original leader Dean O'Banion. To monitor their targets' habits and movements, Capone's men rented an apartment across from the trucking warehouse and garage at 2122 North Clark Street, which served as Moran's headquarters. On the morning of Thursday, February 14, 1929, Capone's lookouts signaled 4 gunmen disguised as police officers to initiate a police raid. The faux police lined the 7 victims along a wall and signaled for accomplices armed with machine guns and shotguns. Moran was not among the victims. Photos of the slain victims shocked the public and damaged Capone's image. Within days, Capone received a summons to testify before a Chicago grand jury on charges of federal prohibition violations, but he claimed to be too unwell to attend. In an effort to clean up his image, Capone donated to charities and sponsored a soup kitchen in Chicago during the Depression. The St. Valentine's Day massacre led to public disquiet about Thompson's alliance with Capone and was a factor in Anton J. Cermak winning the mayoral election on April 6, 1931. Capone was primarily known for ordering other men to do his dirty work for him. In May 1929, one of Capone's bodyguards, Frank Rio, uncovered a plot by three of his men, Albert Anselmi, John Scalise, and Joseph Junta, who had been persuaded by Aiello to depose Capone and take over the Chicago outfit. Capone later beat the men with a baseball bat and then ordered his bodyguards to shoot them, a scene that was included in the 1987 film The Untouchables. Deirdre Bair, along with writers and historians such as William Elliott Hazelgrove, have questioned the veracity of the claim. Bair questioned why three trained killers could sit quietly and let this happen, while Hazelgrove stated that Capone would have been hard-pressed to beat three men to death with a baseball bat, and that he would have instead let an enforcer perform the murders. However, despite claims that the story was first reported by author Walter Noble Burns in his 1931 book, The One-Way Ride, The Red Trail of Chicago Gangland, From Prohibition to Jake Lingle, Capone biographers Max Allan Collins and A. Brad Schwartz have found versions of the story in press coverage shortly after the crime. Collins and Schwartz suggest that similarities among reported versions of the story indicate a basis in truth, and that the outfit deliberately spread the tale to enhance Capone's fearsome reputation. George Meyer, an associate of Capone's, also claimed to have witnessed both the planning of the murders and the event itself. In 1930, upon learning of Aiello's continued plotting against him, Capone resolved to finally eliminate him. In the weeks before Aiello's death, Capone's men tracked him to Rochester, New York, where he had connections through Buffalo crime family boss Stefano Magaddino, and plotted to kill him there. But Aiello returned to Chicago before the plot could be executed. Aiello, angst-ridden from the constant need to hide out and the killings of several of his men, set up residence in the Chicago apartment of Unione Siciliana treasurer Pasquale Patsy Presto Giacomo on North Colmar Ave. On October 23rd, upon exiting Presto Giacomo's building to enter a taxicab, a gunman in a second-floor window across the street started firing at Aiello with a submachine gun. Aiello was said to have been shot at least 13 times before he toppled off the building steps and moved around the corner, attempting to move out of the line of fire. Instead, he moved directly into the range of a second submachine gun positioned on the third floor of another apartment block, and was subsequently gunned down. In the wake of the St. Valentine's Day massacre, Walter A. Strong, publisher of the Chicago Daily News, asked his friend President Herbert Hoover for federal intervention to stem Chicago's lawlessness. He arranged a secret meeting at the White House just 2 weeks after Hoover's inauguration. On March 19, 1929, Strong, joined by Frank Loesch of the Chicago Crime Commission and Laird Bell, made their case to the president. In Hoover's 1952 memoir, the former president reported that Strong argued Chicago was in the hands of the gangsters, that the police and magistrates were completely under their control, that the federal government was the only force by which the city's ability to govern itself could be restored. At once, I directed that all the federal agencies concentrate upon Mr. Capone and his allies. That meeting launched a multi-agency attack on Capone. Treasury and Justice Departments developed plans for income tax prosecutions against Chicago gangsters, and a small, elite squad of Prohibition Bureau agents, whose members included Eliot Ness, were deployed against bootleggers. In a city used to corruption, these lawmen were incorruptible. Charles Schwartz, a writer for the Chicago Daily News, dubbed them untouchables. To support federal efforts, Strong secretly used his newspaper's resources to gather and share intelligence on the Capone outfit. On March 27, 1929, Capone was arrested by FBI agents as he left a Chicago courtroom after testifying to a grand jury that was investigating violations of federal prohibition laws. He was charged with contempt of court for feigning illness to avoid an earlier appearance. On May 16, 1929, Capone was arrested in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, for carrying a concealed weapon. On May 17, 1929, Capone was indicted by a grand jury, and a trial was held before Philadelphia Municipal Court Judge John E. Walsh. Following the entering of a guilty plea by his attorney, Capone was sentenced to a prison term of 1 year. On August 8, 1929, Capone was transferred to Philadelphia's Eastern State Penitentiary. A week after his release in March 1930, Capone was listed as the #1 public enemy on the unofficial Chicago Crime Commission's widely publicized list. In April 1930, Capone was arrested on vagrancy charges when visiting Miami Beach. The governor had ordered sheriffs to run him out of the state. Capone claimed that Miami police had refused him food and water and threatened to arrest his family. He was charged with perjury for making these statements, but was acquitted after a 3-day trial in July. In September, a Chicago judge issued a warrant for Capone's arrest on charges of vagrancy and then used the publicity to run against Thompson in the Republican primary. In February 1931, Capone was tried on the contempt of court charge. In court, Judge James Herbert Wilkerson intervened to reinforce questioning of Capone's doctor by the prosecutor. Wilkerson sentenced Capone to 6 months, but he remained free while on appeal of the contempt conviction. In February 1930, Capone's organization was linked to the murder of Julius Rosenheim, who served as a police informant in the Chicago outfit for 20 years. Assistant Attorney General Mabel Walker Willebrandt is said to have originated the tactic of charging obviously wealthy crime figures with federal tax evasion on the basis of their luxurious lifestyles. In 1927, the Supreme Court ruled in United States v. Sullivan that the approach was legally sound. Illegally earned income was subject to income tax. The key to Capone's conviction on tax charges was not his spending, but proving his income, and the most valuable evidence in that regard originated in his offer to pay tax. Ralph, his brother and a gangster in his own right, was tried for tax evasion in 1930. Ralph spent the next 18 months in prison after being convicted in a 2-week trial over which Wilkerson presided. Seeking to avoid the same fate, Al Capone ordered his lawyer to regularize his tax position, and although it was not done, his lawyer made crucial admissions when stating the income that Capone was willing to pay tax on for various years, admitting income of $100,000 for 1928 and 1929, for instance. Hence, without any investigation, the government had been given a letter from a lawyer acting for Capone, conceding his large taxable income for certain years he had paid no tax on. On March 13, 1931, Capone was charged with income tax evasion for 1924 in a secret grand jury. On June 5, 1931, Capone was indicted by a federal grand jury on 22 counts of income tax evasion from 1925 through 1929. He was released on $50,000 bail. Capone was then indicted on many violations of the Volstead Act. On June 16, 1931, at the Chicago Federal Building, in the courtroom of Wilkerson, Capone pleaded guilty to income tax evasion and the 5,000 Volstead Act violations as part of a 2.5-year prison sentence plea bargain. However, on July 30, 1931, Wilkerson refused to honor the plea bargain, and Capone's counsel rescinded the guilty pleas. On the second day of the trial, Wilkerson deemed that the 1930 letter to federal authorities could be admitted into evidence, overruling objections that a lawyer could not confess for his client. Wilkerson later tried Capone only on the income tax evasion charges, as he determined they took precedence over the Volstead Act charges. Much was later made of other evidence, such as witnesses and ledgers, but these strongly implied Capone's control rather than stating it. Capone's lawyers, who had relied on the plea bargain Wilkerson refused to honor, and therefore had mere hours to prepare for the trial, ran a weak defense focused on claiming that essentially all his income was lost to gambling. This would have been irrelevant regardless, since gambling losses can only be subtracted from gambling winnings, but it was further undercut by Capone's expenses, which were well beyond what his claimed income could support. Wilkerson allowed Capone's spending to be presented at very great length. The government charged Capone with evasion of $215,000 in taxes on a total income of over $1 million during the 5-year period. Capone was convicted on 5 counts of income tax evasion on October 17, 1931, and was sentenced a week later to 11 years in federal prison, fined $50,000 plus $7,000 for court costs, and was held liable for $215,000 plus interest due on his back taxes. The contempt of court sentence was served concurrently. New lawyers hired to represent Capone were Washington-based tax experts. They filed a writ of habeas corpus based on a Supreme Court ruling that tax evasion was not fraud, which apparently meant that Capone had been convicted on charges relating to years that were actually outside the time limit for prosecution. However, a judge interpreted the law so that the time that Capone had spent in Miami was subtracted from the age of the offenses, thereby denying the appeal of both Capone's conviction and sentence. Capone was sent to the United States Penitentiary in Atlanta in May 1932. He was 33. Upon his arrival at Atlanta, Capone was officially diagnosed with syphilis and gonorrhea. He was also experiencing withdrawal symptoms from cocaine addiction, the use of which had perforated his nasal septum. Capone was competent at his prison job of stitching soles on shoes for 8 hours a day, but his letters were barely coherent. He was seen as a weak personality, and so out of his depth dealing with bullying at the hands of fellow inmates that his cellmate, seasoned convict Red Rudensky, feared that Capone would have a breakdown. Rudensky was formerly a small-time criminal associated with the Capone gang, and found himself becoming a protector for Capone. The conspicuous protection by Rudensky and other prisoners drew accusations from less friendly inmates and fueled suspicion that Capone was receiving special treatment. No solid evidence ever emerged, but it formed part of the rationale for moving Capone to the recently opened Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary off the coast of San Francisco in August 1934. On June 23, 1936, Capone was stabbed and superficially wounded by fellow Alcatraz inmate James C. Lucas. Due to his good behavior, Capone was permitted to play banjo in the Alcatraz prison band, the Rock Islanders, which gave regular Sunday concerts for other inmates. Capone also transcribed the song Madonna Mia, creating his own arrangement as a tribute to his wife. At Alcatraz, Capone's decline became increasingly evident as neurosyphilis progressively eroded his mental faculties. His formal diagnosis of syphilis of the brain was made in February 1938. He spent the last year of his Alcatraz sentence in the hospital section, confused and disoriented. Capone completed his term in Alcatraz on January 6, 1939, and was transferred to the Federal Correctional Institution at Terminal Island in California to serve out his sentence for contempt of court. He was paroled on November 16, 1939, after his wife May appealed to the court based on his reduced mental capabilities. The main effect of Capone's conviction was that he ceased to be boss immediately on his imprisonment, but those involved in the jailing of Capone portrayed it as a considerable undermining of the city's organized crime syndicate. Capone's underboss, Frank Nitti, took over as boss of the outfit after he was released from prison in March 1932, having also been convicted of tax evasion charges. Far from being smashed, the outfit continued without being troubled by the Chicago police, but at a lower level and without the open violence that had marked Capone's rule. Organized crime in the city had a lower profile once Prohibition was repealed, already wary of attention after seeing Capone's notoriety bring him down, to the extent that there is a lack of consensus among writers about who was actually in control and who was a figurehead. Front boss. Prostitution, labor union racketeering, and gambling became moneymakers for organized crime in the city without incurring serious investigation. In the late 1950s, FBI agents discovered an organization led by Capone's former lieutenants, reigning supreme over the Chicago underworld. Some historians have speculated that Capone ordered the 1939 murder of Edward J. O'Hare, a week before his release, for helping federal prosecutors convict Capone of tax evasion, though there are other theories for O'Hare's death. Due to his failing health, Capone was released from prison on November 16, 1939, and referred to Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore for the treatment of syphilitic paresis. Because of his unsavory reputation, Johns Hopkins refused to treat him, but Baltimore's Union Memorial Hospital did. Capone was grateful for the compassionate care that he received and donated 2 Japanese weeping cherry trees to Union Memorial Hospital in 1939. After a few weeks of inpatient and outpatient care, on March 20th, 1940, a very sickly Capone left Baltimore and traveled to his mansion in Palm Island, Florida. In 1942, after mass production of penicillin was started in the United States, Capone was one of the first American patients treated by the new drug. Though it was too late for him to reverse the damage to his brain, it did slow down the progression of the disease. In 1946, his physician and a Baltimore psychiatrist examined him and concluded that Capone had the mentality of a 12-year-old child. He spent the last years of his life at his Palm Island mansion, spending time with his wife and grandchildren. On January 21, 1947, Capone had a stroke. He regained consciousness and started to improve, but contracted bronchopneumonia. He suffered a cardiac arrest on January 22nd, and on January 25th, surrounded by his family in his home, died after his heart failed as a result of apoplexy. His body was transported back to Chicago a week later, and a private funeral was held. He was originally buried at Mount Olivet Cemetery in Chicago. In 1950, Capone's remains, along with those of his father, Gabrielle, and brother Frank, were moved to Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois. Dean O'Banion was born to Irish Catholic parents in Aurora, Illinois, and spent his early boyhood in the small town of Maroa in central Illinois. In 1901, after his mother's death, he moved to Chicago with his father and one of his brothers. A second brother, Frank, remained in Maroa. The family settled in Kilgubbin, otherwise known as Little Hell, a heavily Irish area on the north side of Chicago that was notorious citywide for its crime. Years later, Kilgubbin became the site of the infamous Cabrini Green public housing project. As a youngster, Deanie, as he became known, sang in the church choir at Chicago's Holy Name Cathedral. However, neither music nor religion held his interest. Instead, the street life of Kilgubbin caught his eye. An early nickname for O'Banion was Gimpy, due to short left leg, but few people had enough nerve to call him that. The shorter leg was said to be the result of a childhood streetcar accident. O'Banion and his friends, Jaime Weiss, Vincent the Schemer, Drucci, and George Bugs Moran, joined the Market Street Gang, which specialized in theft and robbery for the black market. The boys later became sluggers, thugs hired by a newspaper to beat newsstand owners who did not sell the paper. The Market Street Gang started out working for the Chicago Tribune. However, they later switched to the rival Chicago Examiner due to a more attractive offer from newspaper boss Moses Annenberg. Through Annenberg, the gang met safecracker Charles the Ox Reiser, who taught them his trade. In 1909, Dean was arrested first for safecracking and then for assault. These would be the only times O'Banion would ever spend in a correctional institution. He worked as a waiter at McGovern's Liberty Inn, where each evening he would delight patrons with his beautiful Irish tenor voice and his overly swollen cock as his pals were picking pockets in the coat room. He also drugged his patrons' drinks, known then as slipping a Mickey Finn. When the drunk patrons left the club, him and his pals would rob them. The boys also met the political bosses of the 42nd and 43rd wards through Annenberg. Their job was to use violence to help steer the outcome of elections. With the advent of Prohibition in 1920, O'Banion started a bootlegging operation. He made arrangements for beer suppliers in Canada to start shipments immediately, and also struck deals with whiskey and gin distributors. O'Banion pioneered Chicago's first liquor hijacking on December 19, 1921. He and the lads of Kilgubbin quickly eliminated all their competition. The O'Banion mob, known as the North Side Gang, now ruled the North Side and the Gold Coast, the wealthy area of Chicago situated on the northern lakefront. As O'Banion's name grew in the underworld, he attracted more followers, including Samuel Nails Morton, Three Gun, Louis Altery, and Handsome Dan McCarthy. At the height of his power, O'Banion was supposedly making about $1 million a year on booze. During one famous caper, O'Banion and his men stole over $100,000 worth of Canadian whiskey from the West Side Railroad yards. In another famous robbery, O'Banion looted the padlocked Sibley distillery and walked off with 1,750 barrels of bonded whiskey. In 1921, O'Banion married Viola Caniff and bought an interest in William Schofield's flower shop on North State Street. He needed a legitimate front for his criminal operations. In addition, he was fond of flowers and was an excellent arranger. Schofield's became the florist of choice for mob funerals. Schofield's happened to be across the street from Holy Name Cathedral, where he and Weiss attended Mass. The rooms above Schofield's were used as the headquarters for the North Side Gang. In 19, Johnny Torrio, the boss of the South Side Italian Mafia, later to be called the Chicago Outfit, and his lieutenant, Al Capone, met with all the Chicago bootleggers to work out a system of territories. It was beneficial to everyone to avoid bloody turf battles. In addition, the gangsters were able to pool their political power and their soldiers in the streets. O'Banion accepted the agreement and was ceded control of the North Side, including the desirable Gold Coast. The North Side Gang now became part of a huge Chicago area bootlegging combine. As part of this agreement, O'Banion supplied Torrio and Capone with some of his thugs to help them win the mayoral election of Cicero. O'Banion lived with Torrio's deal for about 4 years before becoming dissatisfied with it. Since the Cicero election, the city had become a gold mine for Johnny Torrio and Al Capone, and O'Banion wanted a cut of it. Despite the fact that Johnny Torrio knew that his Italian-American criminal organization was enormously larger and far more powerful than the North Side Gang, Torrio wanted to keep the peace and not go to war, because he felt it would bring too much heat from law enforcement. To placate him, Torrio granted O'Banion some of Cicero's beer rights and a quarter interest in a casino called The Ship. The enterprising O'Banion then convinced a number of speakeasies in other Chicago territories to move to his strip in Cicero. This move had the potential to start a bootleg war. Torrio attempted to convince O'Banion to abandon his plan in exchange for some Southside brothel proceeds. O'Banion angrily refused, as he despised prostitution. Meanwhile, the Jenner brothers, who was an enforcement arm for Johnny Torrio and Al Capone, and the Jenner brothers controlled Little Italy west of the Loop, Chicago's downtown region, began marketing their whiskey in the North Side, O'Banian's territory. He complained about the Jenners to Torrio, but Torrio demanded him to end his beef with the Jenner brothers. O'Banian then raised the tension between himself and the Jenners on November 3rd by insisting that one of the Jenner siblings, Angelo, pay in full the $30,000 debt he owed to the ship. Not one to back down, he started hijacking Jenner liquor shipments. The Jenners decided to rub out O'Banian and his crew. However, as the Jenner family was Sicilian, it owed fealty to the Unione Siciliani, a mutual benefit society for Sicilian immigrants and front organization and enforcement arm for the Italian-American mafia. They appealed to Mike Merlo, the president of the Chicago branch of the Union. However, Merlo disliked violence and refused to green-light the hit. Meanwhile, O'Banian continued on the offensive. In February 1924, he moved against his South Side rivals by unsuccessfully trying to frame Torrio and Capone for the murder of North Side hanger-on John Duffy. The last straw for Torrio was O'Banian's treachery in the Seaburn Brewery raid. Both O'Banian and Torrio held large stakes in the Seaburn Brewery in Chicago. In May 1924, Dean learned that the police were planning to raid the brewery on a particular night. Before the raid, O'Banian approached Torrio and told him he wanted to sell his share in the brewery, claiming that the Jenners scared him and he wanted to leave the rackets. Torrio agreed to buy O'Banian's share and gave him $2 million. On the night of O'Banian's last shipment, the police swept into the brewery. O'Banian, Torrio, and numerous Southside gangsters were arrested. O'Banian got off easily because, unlike Torrio, he had no previous prohibition-related arrests. Torrio had to bail out himself and 6 associates, plus face later court charges with the possibility of jail time. O'Banian also refused to return the money Torrio had given him in the deal. Torrio soon realized he had been double-crossed. He just had lost the brewery and $2 million in cash, been indicted and been humiliated. Following this incident, Torrio finally ordered the Jenner brothers and the Chicago outfit to kill O'Banian and his entire crew. Therefore, the Jenner brothers and Chicago outfit were determined to take out O'Banian and the entire North Side gang. Johnny Torrio and the Chicago outfit were far more powerful, larger, vicious, dangerous, and feared than O'Banian and the North Side gang, and O'Banian and his criminal organization were no match for Torrio's criminal organization. Despite the fact that the North Side gang were enormously outnumbered and outgunned by Johnny Torrio's Italian-American criminal organization, Chicago outfit, the North Side gang were holding their own against the Johnny Torrio's enormous army of ruthless and efficient killers for approximately 2 years. Using the Merlo funeral as a cover story, over the next few days, the Unione National Director from New York City, Frankie Yale, and other gangsters visited Schofield's, O'Banian's flower shop, to discuss floral arrangements. However, the real purpose of these visits was to memorize the store layout for the hit on O'Banian. On the morning of November 10, 1924, O'Banian was clipping chrysanthemums in Schofield's back room. Yale entered the shop with Torrio Capone gunmen John Scalise and Albert Anselmi. When O'Banian attempted to greet Yale with a handshake, Yale clasped O'Banian's hand in a death grip. At the same time, Scalise and Anselmi fired 2 bullets into O'Banian's chest, 2 in his cheeks and 2 in his throat. Dean O'Banian died instantly. Since O'Banian was a major crime figure, the Catholic Church denied him burial on consecrated ground. However, the Lord's Prayer and 3 Hail Marys were recited in his honor by a priest O'Banian had known from his youth. Despite this restriction, O'Banian received a lavish funeral, much larger than the Merlo funeral the day before. O'Banian was buried in Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois. Due to the opposition from church officials, O'Banion was originally interred in unconsecrated ground. However, his family was eventually allowed to rebury him on consecrated ground elsewhere in the cemetery. The O'Banion killing would spark a brutal 5-year gang war between the North Side Gang and the Chicago outfit that culminated in the killing of 7 North Side Gang members in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre ordered by Al Capone in 1929.
If you haven't already, please take a second to subscribe to the channel, and also don't forget to click on the notification bell so you'll be up to date on all videos released from the Everything Network.
You're watching the Everything Network. Accardo was born on April 28, 1906, in Chicago's Near West Side, the second of 6 children of shoemaker Francesco Accardo and Maria Talotta Accardo. 1 year before his birth, the Accardos had emigrated from Castelvetrano in the province of Trapani, Sicily, Italy to America. At age 14, Accardo left school and started loitering around neighborhood pool halls. He soon joined the Circus Cafe gang, run by Claude Maddox and Tony Capazio, one of many street gangs in the poor neighborhoods of Chicago. These gangs served as talent pools, similar to the concept of farm teams for the city's adult criminal organizations. Jack "Machine Gun" McGurn, one of the toughest hitmen of Chicago outfit boss Al Capone, recruited Accardo into his crew, along with longtime associate Tony Maslach. During Prohibition, Accardo got the nickname Joe Batters, after using a baseball bat to murder 3 mobsters who had betrayed the outfit. Capone was allegedly quoted as saying, "Boy, this kid's a real Joe Batters." In 1939, Chicago newspapers dubbed Accardo the Big Tuna after a fishing expedition to Wedgeport, Nova Scotia, Canada, where Accardo caught a giant 400-pound tuna and was famously photographed with his catch. In later years, Accardo boasted over federal wiretaps that he participated in the infamous 1929 St. Valentine's Day Massacre, in which, allegedly, Capone gunmen murdered 7 members of rival Bugs Moran's North Side Gang. Accardo also claimed that he was one of the gunmen who murdered Brooklyn gang boss Frankie Yale, again by Capone's orders to settle a dispute. However, most experts believe Accardo had only peripheral connections, if any, with the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, and none whatsoever with the Yale murder, which was most likely committed by Gus Winkler, Fred Burke, and Louis Campagna. However, on October 11, 1926, Accardo may have participated in the assassination of Northside gang leader Jaime Weiss near the Holy Name Cathedral in Chicago. In 1932, Capone was convicted of tax evasion and sent to prison for an 11-year sentence, and Frank, the enforcer Nitti, became the new outfit boss after serving his own 18-month sentence for tax evasion. By this time, Accardo had established a solid record of making money for the organization, so Nitti let him establish his own crew. He was also named as the outfit's head of enforcement. Accardo soon developed a variety of profitable rackets, including gambling, loan sharking, bookmaking, extortion, and the distribution of untaxed alcohol and cigarettes. Accardo received 5% of the crew's earnings as a so-called street tax. Accardo, in turn, paid a tax to the outfit's boss. If a crew member refused to pay a street tax, or paid less than half of the amount owed, they would be killed. Accardo's crew included future outfit heavyweights Gus "Gussie" Alex and Joseph "Joey Doves" Ayupa. Working primarily for Al Capone's Jewish-American associate, Jake Guzik, Gus Alex would later become his protege as he rose through the ranks of the Chicago crime family. By 1930, he was suspected in the deaths of at least 5 unsolved murder cases. 2 of the alleged victims, later dying of their injuries, identified him as their assailant, as well as 3 others who were killed after reporting to police extortion and death threats sent by Alex. Under Guzik's guidance, Alex became experienced in securing syndicate protection through bribery of city officials. By the mid-1940s, Gus Alex was the main liaison between the Chicago outfit and City Hall officials. He granted control of the Loop's illegal gambling and prostitution operations, including a lucrative call girl operation out of prominent downtown hotels, of which many call girls were paid up to $500 to $1,000. Alex's operations brought in an estimated $1 million a month for the syndicate. Described as one of the wiliest and slickest crooks within the Chicago outfit, Alex would decline to answer questions under the Fifth Amendment over 39 times during his appearance before the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations of the U.S. Senate Committee on Government Operations. During the 1960s, Alex would come under suspicion during his annual ski trips to Switzerland. The U.S. government accused Alex of illegally depositing Chicago mob money in unnumbered Swiss bank accounts. In the 1940s, Arcadia continued to gain power in the outfit. As the decade progressed, senior members of the outfit were investigated and charged with using the threat of strike action by the labor unions they controlled to extort millions of dollars from Hollywood studios. Nitti, who was claustrophobic and fearful of serving a second prison term, committed suicide in 1943. Paul the Waiter Ricker, who had been the de facto boss since Capone's imprisonment, took the role officially and named Arcadia as underboss. Ricker and Arcadia ran the outfit for 30 years until Ricker died in 1972. When Ricker subsequently received a 10-year prison sentence for his part in the Hollywood scandal, Arcadia became acting boss. 3 years later, when Ricker was barred from contact with mobsters as a condition for his parole, Arcadia became boss of the outfit. In practice, he shared power with Ricker, who remained in the background as a senior consultant. Under Arcadia's leadership in the late 1940s, the outfit moved into slot and vending machines, counterfeiting cigarette and liquor tax stamps, and expanding narcotics smuggling. Arcadia placed slot machines in gas stations, restaurants, and bars throughout the outfit's territory. Outside of Chicago, the outfit expanded into Las Vegas and took influence over gaming away from the 5 families of New York City. Arcadia ensured all the legal Las Vegas casinos used his slot machines. In Kansas and Oklahoma, he took advantage of the official ban on alcohol sales to introduce bootlegged alcohol. The outfit eventually dominated organized crime in most of the western United States. Arcadia phased out some traditional activities, such as labor racketeering and extortion, to reduce the outfit's exposure to legal prosecution. He also converted the outfit's brothel business into call girl services. These changes resulted in a golden era of profitability and influence for the outfit. Arcadia and Ricker emphasized keeping a low profile and let flashier figures, such as Sam Giancana, attract attention instead. For example, when professional wrestlers Lou Albano and Tony Altomare, wrestling as a mafia-inspired tag team called the Sicilians, came to Chicago in 1961, Arcadia persuaded the men to drop the gimmick to avoid any mob-related publicity. 8. By using tactics such as these, Arcadia and Ricker were able to run the outfit much longer than Capone. Once said, Arcadia had more brains for breakfast than Capone had in a lifetime. After 1957, Arcadia turned over the official position as boss to Giancana because of heat from the IRS. Arcadia then became the outfit's consigliere, stepping away from the day-to-day running of the organization, but he still retained considerable power and demanded ultimate respect. Giancana still had to obtain the sanction of Arcadia and Ricca on major business, including murders. However, this working relationship eventually broke down. Unlike Arcadia, the widow Giancana lived an ostentatious lifestyle, frequenting posh nightclubs and dating high-profile singer Phyllis McGuire. Giancana also refused to distribute some of the lavish profits from outfit casinos in Iran and Central America to the rank-and-file members. Many in the outfit also felt that Giancana was attracting too much attention from the FBI, which was forever tailing his car around the Chicago metropolitan area. Around 1966, after Giancana began a year in jail on federal contempt of court charges, Arcadia and Ricca replaced him with Iupa. Sam Giancana was a famous and powerful mafioso and boss of the Chicago outfit from 1957 to 66. He originally got the nickname Mooney. When he became boss, Giancana shortened it to Momo, which stood for more money. Born in Chicago's Little Italy, Sam Giancana was arrested more than 70 times in his life, but was imprisoned only twice. Giancana started his criminal career in the 1920s on Chicago's West Side as a member of a violent street gang called the 42s. He soon developed a reputation for being an excellent getaway driver, high earner, and vicious killer. These qualities got him noticed by the successor to Al Capone, Frank, the enforcer, Nitti. It is widely reputed Giancana and other mobsters had been recruited by the CIA during the waning days of the Eisenhower administration to assassinate Cuban dictator Fidel Castro, who had taken power in January 1959. Giancana was himself reported to have said that the CIA and the Mafia are different sides of the same coin. It is also widely reputed that at roughly the same time, Joseph P. Kennedy recruited Giancana to help mobilize labor union voter and financial support behind his son, Massachusetts Senator John F. Kennedy, in the latter's bid to secure the Democratic nomination for the 1960 presidential election. There are also strong suggestions that during his presidency, JFK maintained close links with Giancana and the Chicago Mafia as he continued the practice of covertly using the Mafia in a bid to assassinate Castro. The two men also shared the same lover, Los Angeles socialite Judith Campbell, who also apparently acted as a courier between the two men, passing money and information. Giancana was forced to step down as mafia boss in 1966 because of his greed, refusing to share the profits of his Latin American gambling operations, a major violation of mafia protocol, excessively high-profile personal behavior, openly associating with various popular entertainers like singers Phyllis McGuire and Frank Sinatra, and serious legal problems, serious enough to have had the FBI place Giancana under close, intense, and relentless surveillance. In response to these setbacks, the dethroned Giancana spent the next 7 years, 1967 to 74, in exile in Cuernavaca, Mexico, until the Mexican government, under pressure from the U.S. Justice Department, had him deported to the United States. Returning to Chicago, Giancana was assassinated on the 19th of June 1975 in the basement of his home in Oak Park, Illinois, which had been under close FBI and Chicago police observation, shortly before he was to appear before a Senate committee investigating CIA and Mafia links to plots to kill Castro. The unknown assassin shot Giancana in the head 7 times with a silenced .22 caliber handgun. Although some suspected the CIA was responsible for the shooting, as Giancana had a somewhat troubled history with the agency, CIA Director William Colby was quoted as saying, "We had nothing to do with it." Many researchers believe Colby's claim, as it seems much more likely that Giancana's one-time friend and Chicago mafia boss Joseph "Joey" Doves Aiuppa ordered the hit on the disgraced Momo because he had become too talkative, and Aiuppa feared Giancana would reveal everything he knew about Chicago mob operations, including Giancana's alleged complicity in orchestrating the JFK assassination during his upcoming Senate committee appearance. Ricca died in 1972, leaving Accardo as the ultimate authority in the outfit. In 1978, while Accardo vacationed in California, burglars entered his River Forest home. Shortly afterward, the 3 suspected thieves and 4 related persons were found strangled and with their throats cut. Law enforcement officials believed Accardo had ordered the killings in retaliation for the burglary. In 2002, this theory was confirmed on the witness stand by outfit turncoat Nicholas Calabrese, who had participated in all of the murders. The surviving assassins were all convicted in the family secrets trial and sentenced to long prison terms. In the late 1970s, Accardo bought a home in Palm Springs, California, flying to Chicago to preside over outfit sit-downs and overlook disputes. By this time, his personal holdings included legal investments in commercial office buildings, retail centers, lumber farms, paper factories, hotels, car dealerships, trucking companies, newspaper companies, restaurants, and travel agencies. Accardo spent his last years in Barrington Hills, Illinois, living with his daughter and son-in-law. On May 22, 1992, Anthony Accardo died of respiratory and heart conditions at age 86. He is buried in a crypt in the mausoleum at Queen of Heaven Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois. During the 1920s, Joey Aiuppa rose through the ranks of the Chicago outfit, beginning as a driver for higher-ranking outfit leaders such as Tony Accardo. He graduated to operate several gambling establishments in Cicero, Illinois. These clubs included bookmaking establishments and underground casinos with secret entrances. In the early 1930s, Aiuppa managed Taylor & Company, ostensibly a furniture manufacturer, though in actuality a front for manufacturing illegal slot machines. Aiuppa was a charter member of Local 450 Union for hotel and restaurant employees. A member of the Capone mob, Aiuppa also had connections to John Dillinger and the Carpis gangs. In 1935, Chicago crime files indicated Aiuppa as a triggerman and expert bank robber for Claude Maddox. Beginning in the late 1940s and well into the 1960s, Aiuppa was in charge of the Cicero district of the outfit. The Cicero district was the highest-earning neighborhood for decades, going back to Al Capone, who headquartered out of this area while he was in command. Joey eventually owned or operated several establishments in Cicero, collectively called the Strip. This was the original Strip before the mob-controlled casino strip in Las Vegas. Prostitution, slot machines, and various gaming activities occurred inside these nightclubs. Aiuppa also owned it for many years and eventually sold the Navajo Hills golf course outside suburban Chicago. This was one of his many real estate dealings that he made money on with his personal take and share of running the most powerful and successful outfit neighborhood for decades. He operated his real estate holdings under Rosemar Realty, named after his mother, Rose Marie. From time to time, Aiuppa also put cars or small real estate in her name, as he would rarely keep any assets in his name, except for the home in which he resided in Oak Brook, Illinois. He also used other relatives, including brothers and later nephews, to hold title to his many constantly changing real estate assets in and around the Chicago area. Joey Aiuppa gained control of the Chicago outfit after the death of Sam Giancana, who had strong support from Paul Ricker and Tony Accardo. Joey Aiuppa became the boss in 1971 after Felix Anthony Milwaukee Phil Alderizio was sent to prison. Under the leadership of Aiuppa, the Chicago outfit grew stronger ties to its Las Vegas casinos. Eventually, he became one of several de facto leaders running the outfit in Chicago. Following his indictment and subsequent imprisonment, Joseph Ferriola ran the outfit from 1985 until 1988. Aiuppa's chauffeur driver and protege, Samuel Carleton, took over leadership operations shortly after. Sometime following the murder of Giancana, Aiuppa bought a house in Palm Springs, California, as had several other Chicago mobsters. In 1986, Aiuppa was convicted of skimming profits from Las Vegas casinos and received 28 years in prison. In 1986, Jackie Cerrone took over control after the semi-retirements of Accardo and Aiuppa as leaders of the Chicago outfit. The convictions of 5 mob ties to skimming $2 million from Las Vegas casinos evolved with Joseph Agosto from the Kansas City crime family testifying against the bosses. Among the few that were imprisoned included Aiuppa, Carl DeLuna, Angelo J. LaPietra, and Jackie Cerrone. LaPietra was a top enforcer for Aiuppa in the Chicago outfit and early years in Cicero crime operations. From prison, Aiuppa chose John No-Nose DeFronzo to run criminal operations in Chicago's western suburbs over acting boss Ferriola. In June 1986, Tony the Ant Spilotro and his brother Michael were beaten to death in Bensonville, Illinois, and buried in a cornfield in Enos, Indiana, 5 miles from Aiuppa property near Morocco, Indiana. Nicholas Calabrese, a member of the outfit, testified that both Spilotro brothers were killed in a home in Bensonville, Illinois, and then buried in the cornfields in Indiana. Calabrese is known to be the first made man to testify against the Chicago outfit. His nephew, Frank Calabrese Jr., was also an informant for the FBI. Calabrese Jr. is the son of notorious mobster Frank Calabrese Sr. However, in a 2010 interview with Maxim magazine, while promoting the opening of the Las Vegas mob experience at the Tropicana Hotel, Tony Spilotro's son Vincent claimed that the real target was his uncle Michael, and Tony was killed to prevent any revenge. Serving nearly 10 years of his sentence, on January 19, 1996, Aiuppa was released from the U.S. Bureau of Prisons Federal Medical Center at Rochester, Minnesota. On February 22, 1997, Aiuppa died at Elmhurst Memorial Hospital in Elmhurst, Illinois. He was buried in Hillside, Illinois, at the Queen of Heaven Cemetery. You're watching the Everything Network. Carleton was born in Buffalo, New York. His brother, Rosario Roy Carleton, was a captain in the Buffalo crime family who was close to Buffalo Mafia boss Stefano Magaddino, which gave Sam Carleton direct access to various East Coast crime families that were aligned with the Buffalo Mafia, such as those based in Rochester and Utica, New York, and in northeastern Pennsylvania. Carleton used these connections to further his gambling and bookmaking interests, fence stolen goods, and possibly for narcotics operations he was overseeing or involved in. He was also a cousin of Chicago outfit mobster Alfonso Al the Pizza Man Tornabang and the uncle to outfit mobsters Dominic and Nicholas DiMaggio. Carleton served as a gunner's mate in the United States Coast Guard during World War II. He was later a resident of Bloomingdale, Illinois. He started his criminal career with the outfit as a driver for mobster Joseph Joey Doves Aiuppa when he was boss of the Cicero, Illinois crew. He earned his nickname, Wings, for his ability to elude police cars and efficiently chauffeur fellow mobsters around Chicago. He became a crew chief, overseeing the outfit's rackets on the west side of Chicago. When Aiuppa was convicted in 1986 for the skimming of the Las Vegas casinos, Carleton was his replacement and frontman. When Joseph Ferriola became the outfit's boss, Carleton served as his underboss. This followed the murders of Michael and Tony Spilotro, in which Carleton had allegedly been involved. After Ferriola was diagnosed with cancer, he assigned the day-to-day supervision of the outfit to Carleton. After Ferriola died, Carleton became the new boss. In December 1990, Carleton bought a 2,500 square foot home in the Tequesta Point neighborhood of Western Florida, where he lived in a home that was listed in the name of his wife, Suzanne. Then, in January 1991, he reportedly went into semi-retirement in South Florida. On January 10, 1992, Carleton was arrested by agents of the FBI, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, and the Broward County Sheriff's Office Organized Crime Division at his home in Weston. He was one of 10 men named in a 15-count federal indictment, alleging that he had approved a failed attempt by the outfit to take over the management of a legal Rincon Indian gambling hall near San Diego, California. The FBI in San Diego had built the case via wiretap recordings from dozens of locations. The trial ended in a hung jury, although 8 others were convicted in the case. In December 1992, Carleton was arrested by the FBI on various charges at O'Hare International Airport in Chicago as he boarded a flight to Fort Lauderdale, Florida. He was denied bail as he was deemed by a judge to be a flight risk. Following a lengthy trial, Carleton and several underlings were convicted in December 1993 of mob racketeering, loan sharking, and arson in connection with an illegal gambling business in the Chicago area and the west suburbs. Convicted with Carleton were his chauffeur James "Little Jimmy" Marcello, Anthony Zizzo, and Anthony Chiaramonte. He was found to have ordered the thwarted murder of outfit associate Anthony Dadino over concerns that Dadino may cooperate with authorities. He also ordered another associate, Lenny Patrick, to carry out an attempted bombing on the Lake Theater, a movie theater in Oak Park, Illinois, during a union dispute. The attack failed when grenades thrown at the building did not detonate. Carleton's sentencing was repeatedly delayed due to ill health. Following his conviction, he underwent 3 major surgeries, including one for an aneurysm in his aorta, and also suffered from kidney problems. On March 18, 1996, Carleton was sentenced to almost 13 years in prison. He also paid $125,000 to the government in restitution. Carleton began serving his sentence at the Federal Correctional Institution, Miami, Florida, although he appealed his conviction and was due to appear at an appeal hearing in an Illinois federal court on January 17, 1997. On December 31, 1996, Carleton was moved from a federal jail cell in Miami to a Dade County hospital after he complained of chest pains. He died of heart disease in the early hours of January 1, 1997, at the age of 75. James Marcello, born December 13, 1943, also known as Jimmy the Man, was a front boss for the Chicago mob in the 1980s, 1990s, and early 2000s. Born in Chicago, Marcello worked for Chicago's Department of Streets and Sanitation from 1960 until 1973, mainly as a laborer. He reportedly became a MAID member in the Chicago mob in 1983, a step that, a mob turncoat testified in 2007, required an individual to be 100% Italian and also to have participated in at least one killing. Actually, and perhaps unknown to Marcello's bosses, Marcello's mother was Irish. Although he had no criminal record, he first became identified by authorities as a critical member of the Chicago outfit in the 1980s because of his role as a driver for Chicago mob bosses Joseph Ayupa and Sam "Wings" Carleton, and as a confidant to Carleton. On December 15, 1992, federal authorities charged Marcello and reputed mob boss Sam "Wings" Carleton with racketeering. Marcello was accused of being the underboss for Carleton, whose street crew worked its rackets in Chicago's western suburbs. On December 16, 1993, Marcello, Carleton, and 5 other crew members were convicted on racketeering charges, with Marcello in particular being found to have run bookmaking, street tax, and juice loan operations in western Cook County and in DuPage County. Marcello and Carleton also were convicted of plotting the never-carried-out murder of gangland associate Anthony Didino. Marcello also was convicted of financing longtime mobster Lenny Patrick's juice loan operation. In addition, Marcello was found to have ordered Patrick to firebomb the Lake Theater in Oak Park, Illinois, during a union dispute. On April 5, 1995, Marcello was sentenced to 121.5 years in prison. During his sentencing, he told U.S. District Judge Paul Plunkett, "If my name wasn't James Marcello, I wouldn't be standing in front of you." That's all I have to say, according to an April 6, 1995 Chicago Tribune news article. In November 2003, Marcello was released from a federal prison camp in Milan, Michigan, and returned to his home in Lombardi, Illinois. During the family secrets trial, it came out that Marcello began working at some point after his 2003 release from prison for DVD Management, an Oak Brook Terrace, Illinois-based operator of nursing homes. In April 2005, Marcello and his younger half-brother, Mickey Marcello, were indicted on murder and racketeering charges. Marcello was accused of murdering Nicholas D'Andrea in 1981, attempting to kill Nicholas Cirillo Sr. in 1982, and murdering brothers Anthony, Tony the Ant, Spilotro, and Michael Spilotro in 1986. Until his indictment, James Marcello also was identified as running the Cicero, Illinois crew faction of the outfit with his brother Michael. The indictment alleged that both Marcellos had operated a lucrative video gambling business named M&M Amusement that had placed video gambling machines in businesses in Berwyn, Illinois, and Cicero, Illinois, from January 1996 until April 2004. Shortly after he was indicted, Marcello attempted to be released on bond, offering to put up homes worth $12.5 million as bond, and also offering to permit law enforcement officials to intercept his telephone calls. The homes included a $9 million house in Oak Brook, Illinois, that was owned by Marcello's niece, Teresa Borsellino, and her husband, $1.1 million of equity in a house in Oak Brook that was owned by Nicholas Vangel, described as Marcello's employer, and his wife, Dorothy, a house in Palos Hills, Illinois, owned by Marcello's son, James Marcello Jr., a summer house in Michigan City, Indiana, owned by James Marcello Jr., a farm in McHenry County, Illinois, owned by James Marcello Jr., and 2 homes in Long Beach, Indiana, owned by James Marcello Jr.'s boss. On April 29, 2005, however, District Judge James Zegel denied Marcello's request to be released on bond. On June 21, 2007, the Operation Family Secrets trial began in Chicago. The case was prosecuted by federal mob prosecutors Mitch Mars, T. Marcus Funk, and John Scully, although several other high-profile defendants, including Frank Calabrese Sr. and Joseph Lombardo, took the highly unusual step of testifying in their own defense. Marcello opted not to take the stand to testify. On September 10, 2007, Marcello was convicted of racketeering conspiracy that involved decades of extortion, loan sharking, and murder. On February 5, 2009, Marcello was sentenced to life in prison for the Spilotro murders, and United States District Judge James Zegel, agreeing with the presentation made by federal prosecutor Marcus Funk, also found Marcello responsible for the D'Andrea murder as well, even though the jury had deadlocked on that count. "Mr. Marcello, you did have the appropriate demeanor in court," United States District Judge James Zegel told Marcello. I believe you possess abilities that your co-defendants Frank Calabrese and Joseph Lombardo did not have. I believe you have self-control and judgment that your co-defendants did not have. You know how to do the right thing. What is most significant is that you could have done better, because perhaps, unlike your co-defendants, you know how to do better. I regret that you did not lead a better life. You are going to pay for your crimes. Marco the Mover, D'Amico, was arrested for gambling in 1958 and 1968, and also for being a patron in an illegal card game in 1976 ran by the Chicago mob. He also was involved in a fight at the corner of Oak Street and Rush Street in Chicago in 1978. He is related by marriage to Robert "Bobby the Boxer" Abenati, who is a made man in the Chicago outfit. He has been arrested twice for DUIs, once in 1983 and another time in 1989. In the 1983 DUI, D'Amico was charged with aggravated battery in Palatine, Illinois, for biting off a police officer's finger during the DUI stop. However, the charges were dropped. For years, however, he was believed by organized crime watchers to be the Chicago outfit's top sports gambling figure, and he was frequently spotted at funerals for top mob figures. On May 20th, 1992, D'Amico was brought before a federal grand jury in Chicago after the bombing of a BMW sports car outside the home in Chicago's West Rogers Park neighborhood of Sharon Patrick, the estranged daughter of turncoat mobster Leonard Patrick, who was set to testify for the prosecution against his old boss, mob fixer Gus Alex. On November 18, 1994, with a 5-year statute of limitations set to expire, he was indicted on charges of conspiring to commit robbery, operating sports bookmaking and poker businesses, using extortion to collect gambling debts and juice loans, and conspiring to commit racketeering. Also indicted were Rick Lentini, who was D'Amico's top aide, and Robert Abenanti, a truck driver for Chicago's Streets and Sanitation Department, who is related to him by marriage. D'Amico, who was ordered held without bond, was accused of running an illegal sports bookmaking business from 1978 until 1992, operating an illegal poker business from 1980 until 1991, attempting extortion against corrupt former attorney Robert Cooley, who was cooperating with authorities and posing as a bookmaker, making juice, or excessively high, loans at rates of 2% a week, extorting street taxes from independent illegal bookmakers, and conspiring to rob a moving, high-stakes poker game near Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, in late 1989. After being confronted with incriminating taped evidence and the cooperation of Cooley, D'Amico on May 1, 1995, pleaded guilty to a conspiracy to rob what he had been told was a high-stakes card game in Lake Geneva in 1989, in which the take could have been as much as $1 million, running a sports bookmaking business and a high-stakes poker game of his own for years, using extortion to collect gambling debts and juice loans, and extorting $1,000 a month payoffs from former Chicago police officer Robert Cooley, so Cooley could operate a poker game in a Chicago social club without mob interference. On October 3, 1995, United States District Judge Blanche M. Manning sentenced him to 12 years and 3 months in prison. During his sentencing hearing, he initially had demanded that the government prove that he was a ranking member of organized crime. However, federal prosecutors had been set to call as many as 8 witnesses, including several former mob insiders, to testify that he was second in command in the Chicago outfit's Elmwood Park street crew under John DeFronzo. Instead, Marco D'Amico abruptly backed off demands that the government prove that he was a made member of the Chicago outfit and signed a stipulation acknowledging his leading role with the Elmwood Park street crew and its link to the mob. By signing this stipulation, he had admitted to his crimes and received a reduced sentence. He was released from federal prison on July 21, 2005. He lived for many years in South Barrington, Illinois. In the 1990s, he moved to Naperville, Illinois, where he lived with his daughter and son-in-law until he went to federal prison. Upon his release from federal prison, D'Amico moved to Westchester, Illinois, where he resided with his wife. D'Amico was married to his wife Patricia for over 50 years and has 4 children. His cousin, a former Chicago police officer, Roland Ricky Borelli, was part of his gambling operation and was convicted in 1995 and sentenced to 10 months in federal prison. Marco D'Amico died on April 22, 2020. DeFronzo, a former enforcer and captain in the Chicago mob, was first noticed in the criminal underworld in 1949. He got the nickname No Nose because he sliced off part of his nose while jumping through a window during a 1949 clothing store burglary. Reportedly, the police gave him back the missing part, which was almost perfectly restored. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison for the burglary. He was a suspect in the unsolved 1952 murder of Charles Gross, a West Side politician with suspected ties to organized crime. He was a member of the 3-Minute Gang and identified as a member of a loan sharking operation, along with former Chicago police officers Albert Sarno and Chris Cardi in 1964. Imprisoned mob boss Joseph Ayupa chose DeFronzo to head criminal operations in Chicago's western suburbs over acting syndicate boss Joseph Ferriola. Eventually, he became one of several de facto leaders running the outfit in Chicago. His brother, Peter DeFronzo, a made man, was convicted of warehouse burglary in 1963. In 1993, DeFronzo was convicted along with Chicago boss Samuel Black Sam Carlisi, his gambling captain Donald Angelini, and 4 other men of federal racketeering charges for attempting to subterfuge gambling operations at the Rincon Reservation near San Diego. The 1993 conviction was reversed on appeal, however, and DeFronzo was released from prison in 1994. In 2009, DeFronzo, Rudy Fratto, and several others were named in a civil lawsuit by Joseph Fosco, the son of late Teamsters treasurer Armando Fosco, alleged to have tried to extort $400,000 from Fosco. DeFronzo died from complications of Alzheimer's disease on May 27, 2018. Angelo the Hook LaPietra was a Chicago mobster involved in extensive loan sharking operations in the city's First Ward during the 1970s and 1980s. It is often repeated that he earned his nickname, the Hook, due to the way he murdered his victims, those that did not or could not pay up. It was said that he would take his victim, bound and gagged, and hang him on a meat hook, piercing the victim's ribcage with the meat hook, and then torture him to death with a blowtorch. The real basis for his nickname was because it was said that once you took a juice loan from him, he would have his hooks in you, and he would use the juice on those loans to get you on the hook for more loans, or property, or businesses as collateral to make good. He was born to first-generation immigrants from Naples, Italy. A high-ranking member of the Chicago outfit, LaPietra had an extensive criminal record stretching back to 1939 that included murder, kidnapping, and narcotics. He was involved in criminal operations in the suburb of Cicero, Illinois, as well as in Chicago's First Ward. LaPietra was a top enforcer under outfit boss Joseph "Joey" Doves Ayupa for Cicero criminal operations. As the result of a 5-year federal investigation into organized crime following the murder of a small-time Kansas City, Missouri mobster, LaPietra was indicted along with Ayupa, Jackie, the Lackey Cerrone, and 15 other mobsters from 5 cities. LaPietra was later accused by a Kansas City grand jury with skimming an estimated $2 million from syndicate-controlled Las Vegas casinos. Federal authorities further charged that, by using money from the Teamsters Union's Central States Pension Fund, the mobsters were able to consolidate their control over some Las Vegas casinos during the 1950s and 1960s. Federal agents had also recorded at least 12,000 hours of phone conversations through wiretaps from organized crime figures in Kansas, Missouri, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Illinois, and Nevada over a period of 4 years. In July 1984, LaPietra's attorney Luis Carbonara requested to federally appointed Judge Joseph A. Stevens, Jr. to have the tapes be transcribed and made available for the defendants. However, due to opposition from Chief David B. Helfrey, the U.S. Department of Justice's Organized Crime Strike Force in Kansas City, Missouri, refused to transcribe the tapes, claiming the difficulties regarding the numerous jurisdictions involved in wiretapping. This issue, among other factors, caused a series of continuances and delays as the case continued for 2 years, and, by September 1985, was called by law enforcement officials as one of the longest in 20 years of prosecution into organized crime. While in prison in Connecticut, 1988, he was disciplined and moved to a more secure prison in Virginia. His soldiers, Shorty and brother Jimmy, were caught smuggling in his favorite Italian food from Chicago. On January 21, 1986, Aiupa, Cerrone, and LaPietra pleaded guilty to conspiring to conceal ownership in a syndicate-controlled Las Vegas casino. LaPietra was sentenced to 16 years imprisonment and fined $143,409. Aiupa and Cerrone were sentenced to 281 half-years imprisonment and fined $43,000 and $430 and $324, respectively. LaPietra was released from prison in 1997. In October 1996, the 25th Ward Alderman Danny Solis, appointed by Mayor Richard M. Daley, presented LaPietra a plaque and award for his leadership and commitment to the community. It recognized him and the Italian club as decision-makers. In 1999, LaPietra died of natural causes. He is buried, along with many other mobsters, at Queen of Heaven Cemetery in Hillside, a western suburb of Chicago.
If you haven't already, please take a second to subscribe to the channel, and also don't forget to click on the notification bell so you'll be up to date on all videos released from the Everything Network.